The day I retired in Texas, my family threw me a party that felt more like a farewell to usefulness than a celebration of achievement. They smiled, they hugged me, they thanked me for my years of sacrifice, but underneath it all I saw the quiet calculation. To them, I had officially crossed from asset to obligation. 42 years of working, saving, and building meant nothing the moment my paycheck stopped. My son Michael was the first to say it, though he tried to wrap it in concern. "Mom, now that you're retired, you should probably downsize. That house is too much for one person." Too much. The same house I bought after my husband passed. The same house I paid off early. The same house where I raised him. My daughter Karen didn't disagree. She just smiled tightly and added, "We just want you comfortable." Comfortable. That word kept circling me like a vulture. Within weeks, things shifted. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. Decisions were made without me. At Sunday dinner, they spoke about finances in lowered voices as if I suddenly couldn't understand numbers anymore. I spent decades managing accounts, negotiating contracts, and protecting assets. But retirement, apparently, made me fragile. The irony was almost poetic. Because while they were quietly repositioning me in their minds as dependent, I was sitting on the one piece of information that would change everything. The trust fund. Not the one they think exists. The one I control. It started years ago, after my husband died unexpectedly. He had always handled investments, but I handled strategy. After the funeral, I met with an estate attorney in Houston who explained something simple: wealth doesn't disappear when someone dies. It shifts hands. And I made sure it shifted correctly. Every rental property. Every oil royalty check from the small parcel of land outside Midland. Every diversified investment account. I structured it into a family trust with one controlling authority. Me. My children are beneficiaries. That much is true. But beneficiaries are not decision makers. They don't know that distributions are conditional. They don't know that I can pause, restructure, or redirect funding based on conduct. They certainly don't know that retirement didn't reduce my income, it increased my leverage. Last month, I overheard Michael telling Karen that they might need to step in soon. Step in. As if I were declining. As if I were confused. They have no idea. They see an aging woman gardening in the Texas heat and assume I'm shrinking. They mistake quiet for weakness. They mistake patience for surrender. What they don't realize is that I've spent my entire life playing the long game. And now that I have time, I intend to play it perfectly. Retirement didn't slow me down. It simply removed distractions. For the first time in decades, I had the luxury of observing without constantly reacting. And what I observed in my own family unsettled me more than I cared to admit. 3 weeks after my retirement party, Michael stopped by unannounced. He used to call first. That small courtesy disappeared quickly. He walked through my house like he was already measuring it for resale, glancing at the ceilings, the windows, the hardwood floors I refinished myself 15 years ago. "Mom," he began, leaning against the kitchen counter, "have you thought more about selling?" There it was again. I poured iced tea slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Selling what? The house. It's a seller's market. You could make a great profit. Move into something smaller. Maybe closer to one of us. Closer. That meant accessible. Observable. Manageable. "I like it here," I said calmly. "The garden is finally growing the way I want." He smiled the way people smile at children who insist on keeping old toys. "You won't be able to keep up with it forever." That word again. Forever. As if my timeline was shrinking by the week. What he didn't know was that the property itself was no longer simply a residence. It had been transferred into the trust 2 years ago. Legally protected. Strategically placed. If I sold, proceeds would cycle back into the trust corpus, not into casual family planning discussions. Later that evening, Karen called. "Michael said you seemed resistant," she said gently. "Resistant. I'm not resistant," I replied. "I'm content." There was a pause. Then she lowered her voice. "Mom, we just worry about cognitive decline. It happens fast sometimes." I nearly laughed. Cognitive decline. I had finalized 3 portfolio reallocations that morning. I had a quarterly review scheduled with the trustee advisory board next week. I still read market reports before breakfast. But in their narrative, I was fading. The subtle repositioning continued. They began offering to help with bills. Suggested they be added to accounts, just in case. Karen casually asked where I kept important documents. I answered vaguely. What they don't understand is this. I anticipated this stage years ago. Not because I distrust my children, but because I understand human nature. When inheritance hovers in the distance, behavior shifts. Texas taught me that. I've seen ranches split apart by greed. Oil checks turn siblings into adversaries. Money doesn't create character, it reveals it. The trust was designed for this exact moment. Conditional distribution clauses. Behavioral benchmarks. Protection triggers. Medical competence requirements verified by independent evaluation, not family consensus. They think they are preparing to manage me. In reality, I have already structured how they will be managed. And I'm beginning to see that the lesson they need isn't about money. It's about respect. The first real crack appeared at Sunday dinner. Karen hosted that week. Her house was newer, larger than mine, financed partially by what she proudly called smart leverage. I knew exactly how much leverage she carried because the trust had guaranteed a portion of her small business expansion loan 3 years ago. She thought the bank had simply believed in her plan. In truth, the bank believed in collateral I quietly provided. We sat around her long oak table, plates filled, conversation light at first. Then Michael cleared his throat. "We've been talking," he said, glancing at Karen, "about making sure everything is organized. For the future. The future again." It hovered over the mashed potatoes like steam. "I am organized," I replied. Karen smiled tightly. "Of course. But we don't actually know where things stand. The investments. Dad's royalties. The properties. So that's what this was. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about visibility. I have estate documents," I said evenly. "They're up to date." Michael leaned forward. "We just think it would be responsible for us to review them. Just in case something happens." "Something like what?" I asked. Silence. Then he said it. "You're 70, Mom." There it was. Not concern. A countdown. I looked at my grandchildren playing in the living room. I looked at my children, who once needed me for everything. And I realized something painful. They had already begun imagining life after me, not emotionally, but financially. What they didn't know is that life after me would not unfold the way they assumed. The trust agreement includes a staggered distribution schedule. No lump sums. No immediate access. Performance-based allocations tied to fiscal responsibility, marital stability, and debt ratios. I built it that way after watching too many inheritances evaporate in less than 5 years. Michael thinks he will expand his real estate portfolio using family capital. Karen assumes her children's private school tuition will be permanently secured. They are partially correct. But control remains centralized. And control requires respect. After dinner, Karen walked me to my car. "Mom," she said softly, "you know we just want transparency." I studied her face. She wasn't malicious. She was anxious. They both were. Their lifestyles depended on expectations. And expectations, when unspoken, turn into entitlement. "Transparency works both ways," I replied. She frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said gently, "that before you ask about my plans, you might consider how you've been planning around me." Her expression shifted. A flicker of realization. They think retirement made me smaller. What it actually did was give me space to see clearly. And I'm beginning to understand that this isn't about safeguarding wealth. It's about safeguarding legacy. The following week, I received an email that confirmed everything. It wasn't meant for me. Michael had forwarded a financial spreadsheet to Karen and accidentally included me in the thread. The subject line read, "Projected Asset Access Timeline." I opened it slowly, not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I already knew. There it was in clean columns and optimistic assumptions. Estimated value of my house. Anticipated liquidation of the Midland mineral rights. A speculative figure labeled Mom's retirement accounts. And beside each number, a projected year. Not if. When. They weren't discussing whether I would pass. They were modeling how soon. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Because numbers don't lie, but they also don't tell the whole story. What they failed to account for was the trust's internal governance clause. The clause that requires annual behavioral review by an independent fiduciary advisor before any discretionary distributions increase. The clause that allows me to reallocate beneficiary percentages if conduct demonstrates financial irresponsibility or coercive pressure. They were forecasting inheritance. I was evaluating character. That evening, Michael called. His voice was casual, overly so. "Mom, did you get that email? It wasn't meant to include you." "Yes," I said calmly. I reviewed it. Silence stretched between us. "We were just planning," he added quickly. "Being proactive." "Planning for what, Michael?" "For eventualities." The word sounded clinical. Detached. "I see," I replied. "Tell me, did your plan include the fact that the mineral rights are in an irrevocable trust?" Another pause. Longer this time. "They're what?" "Irrevocable," I repeated gently. "Meaning they cannot be liquidated without trustee approval." "And who's the trustee?" he asked. I let the answer settle slowly. "I am." The air shifted. He hadn't realized the structure was that firm. In his mind, assets floated loosely, waiting to be claimed. He didn't understand that I had spent years reinforcing the foundation. After we hung up, I sat on my porch and watched the Texas sunset stretch across the sky in orange and violet bands. The land out near Midland still produced modest royalty checks each quarter. Not enormous sums, but steady. Reliable. Like me. They see age and assume fragility. They see retirement and assume decline. What they don't see is the architecture beneath everything. The legal scaffolding. The intentional design. I built this trust not because I expected betrayal, but because I expected human weakness. And now that weakness is surfacing. The question is no longer whether they will respect me. The question is how much they are willing to risk before they learn to. 2 days after that phone call, Karen showed up alone. That alone told me something. She never visits without coordinating schedules, especially now that she runs her consulting business with tight precision. But that afternoon she pulled into my driveway without warning, sunglasses still on, engine running a second longer than necessary before she stepped out. I invited her in without mentioning the email. She didn't sit right away. She walked through the living room slowly, studying the framed photos on the wall. Her father in his oil-field jacket. Michael as a teenager, grinning with braces. Karen holding her first baby, exhausted but glowing. "You've always kept everything together," she said quietly. "I try," I replied. She finally sat across from me. "Michael didn't mean for you to see that spreadsheet." "I know," I said. "But it's not what you think." I folded my hands in my lap. "Then tell me what it is." She exhaled. We need stability. The kids' schools are expensive. The market is unpredictable. If something happened suddenly, we'd be scrambling." There it was. Not cruelty. Fear. "What makes you think something sudden is imminent?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "You're older now." "Older." As if it were a diagnosis. "I go to my doctor regularly," I said. "My health reports are strong. My cognitive evaluations are clear." Her head snapped up. "Cognitive evaluations?" "Yes," I replied evenly. "Part of the trust compliance process." She blinked. Compliance. And that was the moment I saw it, the realization that there was far more structure than they had assumed. "The trust isn't a simple account," I explained. "It has oversight. Benchmarks. Safeguards." "For us?" she asked. "For everyone," I corrected. She leaned back, absorbing it. "You don't trust us," she said softly. "I trust you to be human," I replied. "And humans make decisions differently when money is involved." Her eyes filled, but not with anger. With discomfort. "You think we're waiting for you to die?" "I think," I said carefully, "that you're building plans based on assumptions." Silence settled between us again. I stood and walked to my study. From the safe, I retrieved a single page, not the entire trust document, just the summary of governance structure. I handed it to her. Her eyes scanned quickly, then slowed. "Discretionary distribution subject to behavioral review," she read aloud. Annual fiduciary assessment, trustee authority to modify allocations. She looked up. You can change the percentages? Yes. You can delay payouts? Yes. The weight of that knowledge shifted something in the room. For years, they believed inheritance was a fixed future. Now they understood it was conditional. And conditions are shaped by conduct. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, letting the warm Texas air wrap around me. The cicadas hummed, the orange glow of the sunset softened the edges of the world, and for the first time in weeks, I felt fully in control. Not over the house, not over the spreadsheets, not even over the money itself, but over the perception of it. That, as I had learned, is often more powerful than the assets themselves. Michael didn't call that day, nor the next. I suspected he was processing. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered by a mother he thought he understood completely. And I allowed him that space. Patience was my ally, not haste. Then came the subtle changes. I began to notice Michael's questions during casual phone calls were no longer framed as directives. Have you seen the new property listings? He asked once. The tone was tentative. Careful. Do you think, would you ever consider? It wasn't nagging or instructive, it was seeking guidance. They were learning boundaries without knowing it, and that was far more satisfying than confrontation. Karen called again, this time during a midweek lunch. Mom, I looked at the summary you gave me, she said, voice steady but thoughtful. I think I understand. It's not just money, is it? I sipped my tea slowly. No, I said. It's accountability. It's respect. It's knowing that privilege doesn't give anyone power over the source of it. She paused. So, you're saying we've been wrong? I'm saying that understanding comes before judgment, I replied. You assumed the worst because you didn't have the full picture. Now you do. Her tone softened. I guess I see now, we've underestimated you. That's the easiest mistake to make, I said, setting my cup down. Appearances are deceptive. That week, I took a drive through the outskirts of Midland, surveying the oil fields and the small parcels of land that still generated steady income. I passed by the ranch where my late husband had started our modest portfolio, the wind stirring the grass and carrying the faint smell of earth and iron. Every property was accounted for. Every trust document verified. Every clause designed to protect what mattered most: family integrity, discipline, and long-term stability. By Friday, the change was noticeable. Invitations to join family gatherings returned, this time framed with deference rather than expectation. Michael asked advice on refinancing a property. Karen sought input on an investment decision. They were testing the boundaries, yes, but cautiously, with respect. They were learning, silently, that the rules were no longer theirs to dictate. And I observed, quietly, without a word of correction. Because the most effective lessons are those that are discovered, not enforced. Control, in this instance, came not from confrontation, but from anticipation. I had positioned myself years ago, and now, with patience, they were discovering the framework of accountability I had quietly built. I returned home as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted with streaks of lavender and rose. I stood on my porch and felt the balance of power, subtle yet undeniable. They may have treated me like a burden once. They may have assumed retirement meant weakness. But now, they were learning that patience, strategy, and quiet authority are far more formidable than assumptions ever are. The following weekend, I decided to host a small family gathering at my home. Not a party, nothing extravagant, but enough to signal that I was still present, still observant, still fully capable of managing both the house and the trust. The backyard was neatly trimmed, the flowers in bloom, and the familiar scent of my Texas garden lingered in the air. It was home, and I intended for it to remain so on my terms. Michael arrived first, carrying a briefcase filled with papers. He opened it carefully, as though it contained state secrets, and I couldn't help but smile inwardly. He still believed he was in control. Karen followed shortly after, looking relaxed, but carrying a subtle tension in her shoulders, a quiet acknowledgement that she, too, was navigating new territory. I welcomed them warmly, offering iced tea and letting them settle before mentioning anything about the trust. Conversations started lightly, weather, local news, the grandchildren's school performances, but I observed every glance, every micro-expression. Both of them were calculating, consciously or unconsciously, how I would react, testing boundaries, measuring patience. Then I allowed a pause, just long enough for the air to thicken with expectation. "I've been reviewing some of the family trust allocations," I said casually. "And I noticed something interesting." Their heads lifted immediately, eyes sharp. I let a slow smile form. "It appears some assumptions have been made regarding distributions and timing." Michael's fingers twitched against his papers. Karen's lips pressed together. "Assumptions?" Michael asked, trying to maintain composure. "Yes," I replied. "Assumptions based on what you thought I would allow, rather than what the trust actually dictates." I paused, letting it sink in. It's amazing how quickly people forget that authority doesn't disappear with age. Karen swallowed. We didn't know." "You didn't know," I said softly, "because you didn't ask. You assumed. And assumptions can be dangerous." I could see the shift in their demeanor immediately. The air of entitlement, subtle as it had been, began to dissipate. The reality of oversight, control, and consequence settled in. For the first time in years, they weren't speaking as beneficiaries expecting inheritance. They were speaking as participants in a system they didn't fully understand. By the end of the afternoon, I realized the gathering had achieved more than I anticipated. Michael and Karen had begun to internalize the lesson that retirement doesn't equate to irrelevance, and that authority, especially one quietly exercised, commands respect. They had learned without my needing to raise my voice or enforce rules overtly. As I closed the door behind them that evening, the Texas sun dipping low over the horizon, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. Patience, observation, and strategic foresight had done what confrontation could never achieve. They still didn't fully grasp the full extent of the trust's control, and that was exactly how it should remain for now. The next morning, I walked through the garden with a sense of quiet triumph. Each flower bed, each trimmed hedge, each path I had laid out years ago reflected more than just care, it reflected foresight. Retirement hadn't slowed me down, it had sharpened my vision. I wasn't just tending plants, I was tending the narrative, cultivating the respect my family had assumed was lost. A call came from Michael that afternoon. He sounded hesitant, measured, almost cautious. "Mom, I was wondering, could we review some of the trust summaries together?" he asked. The underlying tone was unmistakable, a mixture of curiosity and deference. It was the first time in months he hadn't tried to assert control. Instead, he sought guidance, a subtle acknowledgement of the authority I had maintained all along. I agreed, suggesting a time that evening. When they arrived, I laid out the summaries on the kitchen table. I didn't overwhelm them with every clause or stipulation. Instead, I focused on the essentials, the structure, the conditional distributions, the discretionary powers. I wanted them to grasp the architecture of the trust without feeling completely powerless. A controlled reveal builds understanding, and understanding fosters respect. Michael leaned over, scanning the pages. I didn't realize the distributions were so conditional," he said. His tone was measured, devoid of the earlier frustration. Karen nodded, her eyes widening as she read. "And the fiduciary reviews. You've really covered everything." I allowed a pause before responding. "I've always believed in preparation. In foresight. Age or retirement doesn't diminish ability, it enhances clarity if used wisely." They both absorbed this quietly. The atmosphere was markedly different from the tension-filled conversations of previous weeks. Instead of entitlement or impatience, there was now careful consideration. They weren't plotting around me, they were evaluating within boundaries I had defined years ago. Later that evening, as they left, I overheard Karen whispering to Michael, "She's more organized than we ever imagined." A small smile curved my lips. Exactly. That was the point. They had underestimated me. They had assumed retirement meant vulnerability, and now they were beginning to see the truth. Alone again, I reflected on the journey. Retirement had been a transition, not a decline. My family's perception had shifted from dismissive to cautious respect, but this was just the beginning. The trust remained under my control, and every interaction, Every subtle correction, every demonstration of patience reinforced my authority without confrontation. The night sky stretched over Texas in deep indigo, the stars scattered like scattered coins of light. I felt the balance of power, subtle yet unmistakable. They may have treated me like a burden initially, but through strategy, foresight, and calm authority, I had reshaped the narrative. The trust was not just financial, it was symbolic, a testament to decades of careful planning and unshakable patience. The following week, I decided to test their understanding in a subtle way. I invited Michael and Karen over again, framing it as a casual discussion about family plans. I wanted to see how much of the lesson had truly sunk in. Often, people nod and say the right things, but their actions betray understanding or a lack of it. We sat around the breakfast table, coffee steaming, sunlight spilling through the windows. I asked them about minor details of the trust one knew they hadn't noticed before: the annual review periods, the discretionary clauses, the way investments were reallocated depending on behavior. At first, they answered hesitantly, unsure of their footing. They were learning to navigate a world they thought they owned, only to realize I still held the map. Michael frowned, trying to reconcile his assumptions with the reality in front of him. "So, you really can modify distributions at your discretion?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," I replied. "And it's designed to encourage responsible management, not just passive expectation." Karen's eyes softened, her expression shifting from defensiveness to reflection. I think we never realized how much thought you put into this," she said quietly. "We assumed everything would just be there for us." I let the statement hang for a moment. Assumption. That had been their mistake all along. They had assumed retirement meant vulnerability, that age automatically diminished capability. In reality, retirement had amplified it. With time, patience, and clarity, I now controlled the narrative entirely. The conversation drifted naturally to investments, and I guided them gently through the details, highlighting how strategic allocations over the years had preserved capital while ensuring steady growth. They listened, genuinely attentive, occasionally asking questions that revealed curiosity rather than entitlement. That was the shift I had hoped for. Later, while they were leaving, Karen paused at the door. "Mom, we've learned a lot today. More than I expected." I smiled faintly. "Good. Learning is more valuable than inheritance, if done correctly." As the car pulled away, I felt the weight of weeks' worth of observation and planning settle like a soft cloak over my shoulders. The subtle change in their behavior confirmed what I had suspected. The trust was not just a financial instrument, it was a tool of influence, a mechanism to guide and teach. Through structure and calm authority, I had begun to reshape how they approached life, responsibility, and respect. By nightfall, the Texas sky was deep and quiet. Crickets sang in the garden, and the stars glittered above. I stood on my porch, reflecting on the journey so far. The burden they had assumed I carried had never been mine to bear. Instead, it had been an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate that age, experience, and patience can command respect in ways that youth and impatience cannot. This realization reinforced the power of observation, subtle guidance, and carefully timed revelations. The story of my retirement was no longer about loss, it was about strategy, clarity, and influence. They may have thought they were in control, but the reality was far different. By midweek, I began noticing subtle changes in how Michael and Karen interacted with me, even when I wasn't present. Phone calls became more respectful, emails more carefully worded, and casual visits were now punctuated with courtesy rather than assumption. The shift wasn't dramatic, it never needed to be, but it was unmistakable. They were learning to navigate the boundaries I had quietly set. That afternoon, I decided to further test their understanding. I invited both of them to my study under the guise of reviewing minor household budgets. In reality, it was a controlled demonstration of their comprehension of the trust and its implications. The study was quiet, warm, filled with natural light streaming through the windows, and lined with books and legal folders, an environment designed to subtly remind them that intellect and preparation still lived here. Michael arrived first, leaning slightly on the doorway, as if measuring the room. Karen followed, her expression cautious but open. I gestured for them to sit at the table, placing a folder in front of each of them. Today, I said, we will review some aspects of the trust that often get overlooked, even by beneficiaries who think they understand it. Michael opened his folder first, brow furrowed. I didn't think there would be so many clauses about conduct and discretionary allocations, he muttered. I nodded slowly. It's all in place to ensure accountability, not to punish. But accountability is essential when managing wealth and responsibility simultaneously. Karen leaned forward. So, these benchmarks, they're there to guide us, not limit us? Yes, I replied evenly. Guidance, oversight, and measured consequence. The goal isn't to take away, but to teach prudence. You see, inheritance is a privilege that comes with responsibility. As they digested the information, I allowed silence to fill the space. Silence often communicates more than words. In that pause, I observed their reactions, the micro-expressions, the slight tension in shoulders, the way their eyes darted between documents and me. They were internalizing the lesson. Later, as they left, Karen said softly, Mom, we really underestimated how carefully you prepared everything. I guess we thought retirement meant, well, that you'd step back completely. I smiled quietly. Retirement isn't stepping back. It's stepping into clarity. Patience and observation are more powerful than haste and assumption. After the door closed, I returned to the porch and looked at the horizon. The Texas plains stretched endlessly, dotted with the golden glow of late afternoon. I felt a deep satisfaction, not from money, not from authority, but from knowing that the lesson had begun to root. They now understood, even partially, that power is exercised with strategy, not with aggression. The trust was more than legal structure, it was a reflection of foresight, discipline, and wisdom. Retirement had given me the time to demonstrate that age is not weakness, and influence does not require force, it requires precision, patience, and clarity. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, I felt certain that they would never view me the same way again. The following weekend, I received a text from Michael, short and careful, Mom, can we talk? No hint of command, no expectation. Just a request framed with subtle respect. I knew immediately that the lessons of the past weeks had begun to influence his approach. When they arrived, I offered lemonade on the porch. The air was warm, the cicadas humming faintly, the garden in full bloom, a serene setting that contrasted sharply with the tension I anticipated inside. Michael sat first, then Karen, and we began with light conversation, allowing them to feel comfortable before introducing the true purpose of our meeting. I wanted to discuss a potential investment opportunity, Michael began cautiously. But I want to make sure we follow the guidelines you've set. I don't want to misstep. I raised an eyebrow. Misstep? How do you define misstep? He paused. By making assumptions that overstep your authority. I realize I've done that before. Karen nodded, her expression earnest. We underestimated how much oversight you maintain. It's humbling. I smiled faintly. Humbling is often necessary for growth. I'm not here to punish or control unnecessarily. I'm here to ensure that decisions are made responsibly and thoughtfully. Michael opened his briefcase and produced charts and documents. We've recalculated the projections, taking into account the distribution benchmarks you've outlined, he said. We want to present options for your review before acting. I listened attentively, offering guidance, but allowing them to speak. The subtle balance was crucial. They needed to feel heard, while simultaneously acknowledging that ultimate authority remained with me. This was the delicate dance of influence. Lead without force, guide without dictating, and allow them to internalize lessons naturally. Hours passed with discussion, refinement, and observation. By the end, I sensed a profound shift. Their previous attitude, one of entitlement, impatience, and quiet disregard, had evolved. They were beginning to understand that trust is earned, not assumed, and that retirement does not equate to irrelevance. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner alone, I reflected on the transformations taking place. The subtle power of foresight, patience, and strategic guidance had changed more than their understanding of the trust. It had altered how they perceived me entirely. I was no longer the passive retiree they once dismissed. I was the architect of both the financial future and the moral framework within which they would operate. The Texas sky darkened, stars beginning to pierce the twilight. I looked out over the land, the garden, the properties that formed the foundation of the trust, and I felt an unmistakable sense of satisfaction. Retirement had not diminished me, it had amplified my influence, clarified my authority, and prepared my family for lessons they never anticipated learning. This was only the beginning. The story of being underestimated, treated like a burden, and ultimately asserting control with quiet authority was far from over. They would continue to learn, adapt, and, if guided correctly, emerge wiser, more responsible, and ultimately grateful. The following week brought a subtle test I had planned long ago. I intentionally left certain correspondence in plain sight on my desk, letters from the trustee, investment reports, and a minor notice about property taxes. Nothing sensitive, but enough for Michael and Karen to notice and react. The goal wasn't to spy or trick them, it was to observe how they interpreted the situation. Michael arrived first, walking past the desk, his eyes flicking briefly toward the documents. Karen followed, glancing even more deliberately. "Are those trust documents?" she asked cautiously. "Yes," I replied calmly, "they are summaries, not the full details. It's important to review selectively, carefully, and with understanding of context." They exchanged a glance. Michael tried to smile. "I didn't realize how extensive this all is," he said. "We've always thought the house and a few investments were the main components." "And you were wrong," I said gently. "The trust encompasses more than just tangible assets. It includes behavioral benchmarks, oversight mechanisms, and strategic protections designed to ensure sustainability. In other words, responsibility is as important as entitlement." Karen nodded slowly. "I think we've underestimated how much planning went into this. I guess we assumed retirement meant you'd step back entirely." I sipped my tea, letting the words settle. Retirement is not stepping back. Retirement is clarity. It's the perfect time to exercise oversight without distraction, to teach lessons without aggression, and to ensure that what is entrusted to you is respected and managed wisely. We discussed property allocations, royalty management, and investment strategies. I allowed them to contribute ideas, testing whether they understood conditional responsibilities and the balance between initiative and respect. They offered suggestions hesitantly, framing every question with caution and awareness that ultimate authority rested with me. After 2 hours, I observed a noticeable change in demeanor. The arrogance and entitlement that had shadowed prior visits were gone, replaced with careful curiosity and a desire to comprehend. They were beginning to internalize the lesson. Control does not vanish with age. Influence can be exercised quietly, and retirement does not equal weakness. As they left, Karen said softly, "Mom, we're starting to see the bigger picture. I think we really have a lot to learn from your approach." I smiled faintly, knowing she had grasped part of the lesson, though not yet fully. Patience remained essential. Lessons learned gradually are the ones that endure. That night, I stood on my porch, looking out across the Texas plains. The trust was more than financial structure, it was a living framework of authority, foresight, and moral guidance. Each subtle interaction with my family reinforced it, each observation confirmed it. Retirement had given me not a loss of relevance, but an opportunity to demonstrate enduring wisdom, strategy, and quiet power. The next morning, I noticed a shift even in the casual way my grandchildren interacted with me. Previously, they had treated me as a distant observer. Grandma was there, but her presence didn't command attention. Now, they asked questions, sought advice, and lingered in the living room longer, curious about the decisions I made and the way I managed the family trust. They sensed authority in me, even if they didn't fully understand its depth. Michael and Karen arrived later that day, and I decided to introduce a controlled scenario to test their application of what they had learned. I presented them with a hypothetical situation involving a sudden market change affecting one of the rental properties. They had to discuss potential actions, consider consequences, and make decisions within the framework of the trust, without me providing all the answers. Michael began hesitantly, suggesting liquidating certain assets to cover short-term losses. Karen countered carefully, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the property's long-term profitability. I observed quietly, letting them negotiate. The tension in their posture revealed awareness. They were cautious not to overstep, but also intent on participating responsibly. After 20 minutes, I interjected gently. "You're both approaching this correctly," I said. "But remember, discretionary oversight exists for a reason. Decisions are not solely about immediate gains. They must consider conduct, impact, and sustainability." They paused, reflecting. The realization began to sink in. The trust was not merely a financial instrument, but a tool for teaching measured responsibility. My retirement had not reduced my influence. It had amplified it. Authority need not be enforced loudly. It is often most powerful when exercised subtly and observed patiently. Later, as they prepared to leave, Michael spoke first. "Mom, I think we finally understand the depth of your planning. We've underestimated how much foresight went into this." Karen nodded. "We've also learned that assumptions about retirement or age can be misleading. You're still fully capable and more strategic than we realized." I smiled inwardly. That acknowledgement was exactly what I had hoped to achieve. Over time, small realizations compound, reinforcing understanding and reshaping behavior. This was a victory not of wealth, but of influence, clarity, and respect. Alone afterward, I reflected on the lessons I had imparted. The trust, carefully structured, was only part of the story. Equally important were the subtle interactions, the observations, and the patience that allowed my children to arrive at understanding themselves. They now approached decisions with caution, respect, and humility, qualities I had long hoped to instill. The sun dipped behind the Texas horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the land. I stood on the porch, surveying the property, the garden, and the quiet streets. Retirement had not diminished me. It had provided the clarity, time, and space to ensure that my family would learn lessons of responsibility, respect, and accountability, even if they only fully grasped them later. A few days later, I noticed Michael checking in more frequently, but differently than before. His questions were now precise, measured, and respectful. He no longer assumed authority or shortcuts. He sought guidance, aware that the ultimate control rested with me. This was exactly the change I had been cultivating. I decided it was time for another subtle lesson, this one designed to reinforce the consequences of assumption and impatience. I presented a minor discrepancy in one of the trust's property accounts, a small miscalculation that, if handled without oversight, could have led to unnecessary financial risk. I didn't provide the solution immediately. I simply outlined the problem and observed. Michael and Karen approached it together, analyzing the data cautiously. At first, Michael suggested a quick correction without consulting the guidelines, but Karen reminded him of the review procedures. I stayed silent, letting them self-correct. The moment they recognized the importance of following procedure, I saw the shift complete. They understood that authority, oversight, and responsibility were intertwined, and that my retirement did not diminish my ability to enforce these principles, it clarified them. Afterward, I gently commended their efforts. "This is exactly how decisions should be made," I said. "With awareness, caution, and adherence to established structure. Assumptions can be costly, but careful evaluation ensures stability and respect." Karen leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I never realized how much discipline and foresight went into everything. You've structured this not just to protect wealth, but to teach lessons." "Correct," I replied. "The trust is as much about character as it is about assets. Wealth without responsibility is fragile, easily lost or mismanaged. And responsibility without oversight is equally dangerous." As they left later that afternoon, I noticed a subtle change in their demeanor that confirmed the lesson had taken root. Michael's steps were measured, his eyes no longer darting to assess or assume. Karen walked with a quiet confidence, no longer testing boundaries unnecessarily. Respect was now the framework guiding their actions. That night, I sat on the porch under the wide Texas sky, stars beginning to scatter across the indigo horizon. I reflected on the journey from retirement to clarity, From being treated like a burden to becoming the quiet architect of lessons my family would carry forward. Each interaction had been deliberate, each observation intentional. Retirement, I realized, is not a retreat. It is an opportunity to apply wisdom, patience, and strategy in ways that reshape behavior and perception. Authority is not about assertion. It is about understanding, subtle influence, and timing. And when exercised with foresight, it teaches lessons that endure far beyond immediate control or confrontation. The garden was quiet, the wind rustling the leaves, and I felt the satisfaction of having completed another phase of this ongoing lesson. My family was learning, slowly but surely, that underestimating experience is always a costly mistake. The following week, I decided to elevate the lesson slightly, introducing a scenario designed to test their integrity and judgment. I had arranged for an independent financial audit of a small portion of the trust's assets, a routine check, but one they didn't know I had scheduled. The audit's findings were intentionally neutral, but the way they responded would reveal their true understanding of responsibility and discretion. When Michael and Karen arrived, I presented the audit summary in a casual manner, letting them examine it before commenting. Michael's brow furrowed slightly as he read. "So, these numbers are accurate?" he asked, trying to maintain composure. "Yes," I said. "The numbers reflect careful management. But what matters is not just accuracy, it's how you interpret and act on it." Karen looked up, curiosity and apprehension mingling in her expression. "Meaning what?" I leaned back slightly, letting the words hang. "Meaning that decisions made hastily or without proper understanding can create long-term consequences. Wealth without prudence is fragile. Oversight without comprehension is ineffective. The true lesson here is not in the audit itself, but in how you respond to it." They exchanged glances. Slowly, they began discussing the findings together, this time more cautiously than in previous exercises. They analyzed the data, referenced procedural guidelines I had subtly provided, and arrived at conclusions that respected both the trust's framework and the principles I had instilled. I observed quietly, letting them navigate without interference. It was gratifying to see the patience, foresight, and strategic thinking I had cultivated over the past weeks manifesting in their actions. The confidence with which they approached the situation reflected the understanding that authority is not about immediate compliance, but about internalizing responsibility. After the exercise, I spoke gently. "Today, you demonstrated awareness and prudence. This is how accountability is maintained. Decisions must always be guided by understanding, not assumption. You've taken a significant step forward." Michael nodded, a subtle humility in his voice. "I see now that control isn't just about ownership. It's about respecting the structure and the person guiding it." Karen smiled, her demeanor softened. "We've underestimated the importance of patience and clarity." "I understand that now." As they left, I watched them drive away, their expressions contemplative yet respectful. The lesson had taken root, and I knew that future interactions would be guided by the awareness they had gained. The subtle authority I maintained was now acknowledged and appreciated, even if not overtly spoken. Later, I sat alone on the porch under the Texas stars. The garden was quiet, the air warm, and the horizon stretched endlessly. Retirement had been the perfect stage for these lessons, time to observe, guide, and correct without overt confrontation. My family was learning that age is not weakness, that patience is power, and that respect is earned through clarity, foresight, and strategic action. By the following week, I began noticing small, meaningful changes in their daily habits. Michael now double-checked numbers before sending financial requests, and Karen spoke with a subtle caution whenever discussing potential purchases or investments. The impatience that once marked their approach to the trust had been replaced by thoughtful deliberation. These were small signs, but to me, they represented monumental progress. I decided to introduce another scenario to reinforce lessons of foresight and accountability. I presented them with a simulated opportunity, a new property development in the outskirts of Austin. The project seemed profitable at first glance, but hidden within the paperwork were subtle risks, zoning issues, fluctuating market trends, and potential environmental regulations. I left it to them to identify the pitfalls and determine the next steps. Michael approached first, suggesting immediate purchase to capitalize on the market. Karen hesitated, examining the details. "Wait," she said, pointing to a note in the documents. "We need to consider compliance and long-term sustainability. Rushing might create problems later." I let them work through the scenario without interruption. Watching them debate, negotiate, and reach consensus within the boundaries I had established, I felt a quiet satisfaction. They were learning that discretion, analysis, and patience mattered more than impulse or assumption. After they presented their plan, I gave my input not to correct, but to guide. "You've both done well identifying potential risks and considering long-term implications," I said. "This is exactly the kind of decision-making the trust is designed to encourage. Remember, responsibility precedes privilege. Wealth without thoughtful management is unstable, and authority without understanding is empty." Karen exhaled softly. "I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture. It's not just money, is it? It's lessons about how to act, how to think, and how to respect the process." Michael nodded, a quiet confidence in his voice. "And patience. I never thought patience would feel so strategic." Later that evening, after they left, I walked the property, observing the land, the quiet streets, and the small parcels generating steady income. Each acre, each trust clause, each carefully constructed provision had served its purpose. The lessons were taking root. They were learning to operate within the framework I had built, slowly internalizing the understanding that authority is neither assumed nor inherited, it is demonstrated and respected. The Texas sun set behind distant hills, casting long shadows across the garden. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not for the wealth itself, but for the growth, awareness, and understanding that had begun to flourish within my family. Retirement had not diminished me. It had sharpened my clarity, strengthened my influence, and allowed me to guide them toward respect, responsibility, and wisdom in ways they could now appreciate. The next morning, I received a text from Michael. "Mom, I reviewed the documents again. Can we discuss a couple of questions?" The careful tone was telling: no demands, no assumptions, only measured curiosity. I smiled quietly. This was the change I had been cultivating all along. They were beginning to approach me as a partner in decision-making, not as an obstacle or resource to exploit. When they arrived, I invited them to the porch, coffee in hand. I allowed the conversation to start casually before steering it toward the trust, subtly emphasizing the principle of foresight. "Today," I said, "let's discuss scenario planning. It's easy to react to immediate events, but true strategy comes from anticipating potential outcomes and preparing accordingly." Michael leaned in, adjusting his glasses. "You mean like market changes, property fluctuations, unexpected expenses?" "Yes," I replied, "but also human behavior. Decisions are influenced by emotion, perception, and assumption. Anticipating reactions is just as important as analyzing numbers." Karen nodded slowly. "I think I understand now." We were approaching things with a mindset of entitlement, assuming the trust existed to serve us immediately, rather than understanding the structure and expectations. "Exactly," I said. "Authority isn't about issuing commands or issuing resources. It's about guiding, observing, and creating frameworks where lessons can be learned and respected." I presented them with a hypothetical dilemma. One of the properties required urgent maintenance, but addressing it would temporarily reduce cash flow for another investment. I asked them to discuss and decide how to proceed. Michael suggested prioritizing immediate fixes, but Karen reminded him to review long-term impacts. Together, they created a plan that balanced responsibility and prudence, demonstrating comprehension of the trust's objectives. After the discussion, I spoke gently. "What you've demonstrated is understanding. You're beginning to internalize that the trust isn't just a collection of assets, it's a structure that reflects discipline, foresight, and accountability. Actions must align with these principles if they are to succeed." As they prepared to leave, Michael said softly, "Mom, I see now that your approach isn't restrictive. It's protective. And it's made us think more carefully about our decisions." Karen smiled. "We've learned patience, respect, and strategic thinking." And honestly, it's changing how we view you too. Watching them leave, I felt the weight of progress. The shift wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was lasting. They had begun to comprehend the trust not as an entitlement, but as a teaching tool, a structure for growth, and a reflection of my enduring influence. That evening, I walked through the Texas garden, the cicadas humming softly in the warm air. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a deep, indigo sky dotted with stars. Retirement had given me not only time and perspective, but the opportunity to guide, influence, and shape behavior with subtle authority. Age had not diminished my power, it had refined it. A few days later, I decided it was time to introduce a more personal lesson, one that would blend emotional awareness with the financial and procedural lessons I had been cultivating. I invited Michael and Karen over for lunch, framing it as a casual family gathering. The table was set simply, with fresh flowers from the garden and plates of homemade comfort food, a subtle reminder of the warmth, stability, and care I had always provided. We began with light conversation, laughter at childhood memories, and discussions about the grandchildren. Then I steered gently toward the topic of legacy. I want to talk today about responsibility, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of family, integrity, and trust, I said, keeping my tone warm but deliberate. Michael leaned forward, attentive. You mean, like how we should manage the assets responsibly? Yes, I replied, but also how we manage ourselves and each other. The trust is not just money, it's a reflection of values. Decisions made without reflection affect everyone. Timing, patience, and foresight are just as important as financial gain. Karen nodded slowly. I see now. We've treated inheritance as entitlement rather than a responsibility. I think we assumed retirement meant you'd relinquish authority. Retirement, I said gently, is not stepping back. It's stepping into clarity. It's the perfect time to exercise influence, shape behavior, and demonstrate lessons through experience rather than force. Authority isn't about control, it's about guidance and oversight. To test their understanding, I presented a scenario involving a potential philanthropic contribution. The sum was substantial, and the impact could be significant, but there were stipulations. The funds could only be used strategically and in alignment with values defined within the trust. I asked them to discuss and decide how to approach it. Michael suggested allocating most funds immediately to maximize visibility, while Karen emphasized evaluating long-term impact and alignment with the family's legacy. They negotiated carefully, balancing each perspective, ultimately arriving at a plan that satisfied both prudence and impact. I observed, quietly noting their tone, reasoning, and willingness to compromise. They had begun internalizing lessons that could not be taught through instruction alone. They were practicing judgment, patience, and respect. As they departed, Michael said quietly, "Mom, I finally understand that the trust isn't just about assets. It's about guiding us to be better, more thoughtful, and more responsible." Karen added, "And it's making me rethink how I approach decisions, not just financially, but in life." After the door closed, I stood on the porch under the deepening Texas sky, stars twinkling faintly above. I reflected on the progress we had made. Retirement had provided me with clarity, perspective, and time to influence, not through force, but through structure, patience, and subtle guidance. My family's understanding was evolving, and with it, the respect I had long desired was finally taking root. The following week, I decided to introduce a scenario designed to test their decision-making under pressure. I called it a practice exercise, though in reality, it was a subtle way to gauge how well they were internalizing lessons about responsibility, patience, and authority. The scenario involved a sudden maintenance issue at one of the rental properties, a leaking roof that could escalate into significant damage if not addressed properly. Michael arrived first, already tense from his busy schedule. Karen followed, alert and thoughtful. I explained the situation without providing solutions, observing their reactions carefully. Michael immediately began suggesting quick fixes, short-term solutions to prevent immediate loss. Karen, on the other hand, reminded him to evaluate the long-term impact and consider costs, legal obligations, and sustainability. I allowed them to debate, offer solutions, and weigh outcomes. The discussion lasted nearly an hour, during which they navigated assumptions, budget limitations, and timing. Neither of them attempted to override the other. They listened, considered, and revised their proposals according to reason rather than emotion. When they presented their final recommendation, a plan that balanced immediate repair with strategic oversight, I nodded approvingly. "Excellent," I said. "You've demonstrated understanding of discretion, foresight, and responsibility. The trust is designed to teach this very balance, short-term action informed by long-term vision." Karen leaned back, reflecting. "I think I understand now. It's not about limiting us. It's about guiding us to act responsibly." Michael nodded. "And respecting the process. I never realized how much preparation and structure you put into the trust." I allowed a moment of silence. Silence often reinforces lessons more than words. They had learned to respect the authority inherent in experience, to value oversight, and to internalize responsibility without being instructed at every step. Later, as they prepared to leave, Karen said softly, "Mom, we're beginning to see that retirement hasn't diminished you, it's sharpened your strategy. Everything you've set up isn't just about money, it's about teaching us how to act wisely." Michael added, "We've underestimated how much thought went into this. We're learning more than we expected, and it's changing how we make decisions." After the door closed, I walked through the garden, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. Each step on the path, each bloom in the garden, and each parcel of land represented years of planning, patience, and strategy. Retirement had been the perfect stage to exercise authority with subtlety, to influence without confrontation, and to guide without forcing comprehension. The Texas sun had nearly set, painting the horizon in warm hues of orange and gold. I stood quietly, reflecting on how far my family had come in understanding the trust, the principles behind it, and the lessons embedded within every clause. The journey from being treated like a burden to becoming the respected, strategic guide was complete in its first major phase, but the lessons would continue, unfolding over time as patience and foresight guided every interaction. A few days later, I decided to give Michael and Karen a scenario involving negotiation, testing both their judgment and their ability to collaborate under subtle pressure. I framed it as a potential sale of one of the smaller properties in the trust, profitable, but with hidden long-term risks if mismanaged. I wanted to see if they would approach it with impulsiveness or measured foresight. Michael arrived first, immediately reviewing the numbers. His instincts leaned toward immediate gain, selling quickly to capitalize on the market. Karen, as I expected, countered carefully, emphasizing the importance of evaluating long-term implications, tenant stability, and potential zoning changes. I observed quietly, allowing them to negotiate and challenge each other respectfully. After some discussion, Michael paused. "I think I see now that we were too focused on short-term profit before," he admitted. "We assumed action without considering consequences." Karen nodded. "We were impatient, and we underestimated the structure you built. It's not restrictive, it's a framework to guide us responsibly." I smiled faintly. "Exactly. The trust isn't just a collection of assets, it's a system of checks and guidance. Actions taken without comprehension can jeopardize everything. Strategy, patience, and foresight are far more valuable than immediate results." They continued analyzing the scenario, presenting a plan that balanced revenue with sustainability, demonstrating an understanding of both financial prudence and procedural adherence. Their discussion reflected subtle shifts in behavior, measured tones, careful phrasing, and mutual acknowledgement of the trust's boundaries. They were internalizing lessons without me needing to impose them. Afterward, I offered feedback, highlighting their improvements. "Today, you've demonstrated judgment that reflects understanding, not assumption. This is the essence of responsible management, decisions grounded in comprehension, guided by principles, and balanced with foresight." Karen exhaled, a mix of relief and realization on her face. "I think we finally understand what it means to approach decisions thoughtfully, not impulsively." Michael added, "And to recognize that retirement doesn't diminish authority, it clarifies it. You've set up a system that teaches without confrontation." As they left, I stood on the porch, observing their departure. The Texas wind carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, the sun dipping behind distant hills. I reflected on the progression of the past weeks, from entitlement and impatience to respect, understanding, and measured decision-making. Retirement had provided the perfect stage for these lessons. Time, perspective, and quiet authority allowed me to guide my family toward comprehension, responsibility, and respect. The trust was no longer just a legal framework. It was a living tool for influence and learning, carefully revealing itself as my family gradually came to understand its depth. The following week, I noticed Karen taking initiative in small ways I hadn't expected. She began organizing her notes on the trust, highlighting key provisions, and even cross-referencing clauses that related to investment decisions. Michael, too, approached matters more cautiously, consulting her and considering long-term impacts before making suggestions. Their subtle coordination reflected a remarkable shift from the days when impatience and assumption dominated their interactions. I invited them over once more, framing it as a casual afternoon discussion about potential family projects. My goal was to test their judgment under realistic circumstances while reinforcing the importance of foresight, collaboration, and adherence to the trust's principles. I presented a hypothetical challenge, a sudden opportunity to lease a commercial property at a premium rate. The catch was that the lease was contingent on specific maintenance commitments that required upfront investment, and any miscalculation could compromise future revenues. I asked them to plan and present a strategy for managing the situation. Michael immediately began calculating short-term profits, while Karen carefully evaluated the broader implications, including cash flow, tenant satisfaction, and legal obligations. They debated, negotiated, and refined their approach, demonstrating increasing awareness of the need to balance opportunity with responsibility. Their discussion reflected not only understanding of financial implications, but also respect for the structural guidelines of the trust. I observed quietly, noting micro-expressions, hesitations, and moments of collaborative insight. These subtle cues revealed genuine internalization of the lessons I had been teaching. When they presented their plan, I offered guidance rather than correction. "You've done well," I said. "This plan reflects not only foresight, but respect for the process and for each other's input. It demonstrates that the trust is more than assets. It is a framework for responsible decision-making." Karen smiled. "It feels different now. We approach decisions thinking through the consequences rather than rushing. I didn't realize how much strategy and patience mattered." Michael nodded in agreement. "We've underestimated how much thought and structure you put into this. Retirement hasn't weakened you, it's sharpened your perspective. We're finally seeing that." As they prepared to leave, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The subtle authority I exercised had transformed their approach, cultivating respect, awareness, and responsible judgment. They were beginning to internalize the lessons that could not be learned through instruction alone, through observation, reflection, and careful guidance. That evening, standing on the porch under the vast Texas sky, I reflected on the journey from being perceived as a burden to becoming the guiding force behind their understanding. The trust was not merely financial, it was an instrument of influence, teaching, and subtle leadership, cultivated with patience, foresight, and clarity. My retirement had become the most powerful tool for shaping comprehension, responsibility, and respect in my family. By midweek, I observed a deeper change in their interactions with each other and with me. Michael and Karen were no longer reacting impulsively or speaking without consideration. They asked questions thoughtfully, weighed potential consequences, and sought my input when necessary. The transformation wasn't just behavioral, it was psychological. They had begun to internalize lessons about patience, discretion, and respect for authority. I decided to introduce a scenario that combined financial judgment with ethical decision-making. A minor dispute had arisen among tenants in one of the rental properties, and I asked Michael and Karen to resolve it hypothetically, using both the trust's framework and common sense. The goal was to evaluate not just their comprehension of procedural rules, but their ability to exercise fairness and judgment under subtle pressure. Michael proposed a solution that would satisfy the majority quickly, but risked marginalizing one tenant. Karen immediately countered, emphasizing fairness, transparency, and adherence to rules that protected all parties. Their discussion was measured, respectful, and collaborative, a stark contrast to previous encounters where impatience and assumption dominated. I observed quietly, noting their reasoning and subtle cues of understanding. "You're approaching this correctly," I said finally. "Decisions must balance immediate results with long-term consequences, ensuring that integrity is maintained. Responsibility isn't just about money. It's about fairness, foresight, and respect for all involved." Karen nodded, thoughtfully. "I see now that every action has ripple effects, and assuming shortcuts can backfire. We need to think carefully before acting." Michael added, "We've learned that authority isn't diminished by retirement, it's clarified. You've built a system that teaches us responsibility through structure, patience, and guidance." Later that evening, as they left, I reflected on the progress. The subtle authority exercised over the past weeks had transformed not only their behavior, but their understanding. They were beginning to see the trust not as entitlement, but as a framework for teaching values, responsibility, and foresight. The Texas sky darkened, stars beginning to pierce the indigo horizon. I walked through the garden, the warm wind rustling the leaves, reflecting on the journey. Retirement had been the perfect environment to cultivate respect, clarity, and comprehension. The trust was more than financial, it was a living instrument for shaping character and decision-making. I realized that the lessons I had instilled would continue to unfold over time, guiding my children toward maturity, patience, and appreciation for strategy. Each interaction, each controlled scenario, and each subtle observation had reinforced a crucial point: underestimating experience, wisdom, and preparation is always costly. By the time I entered the house, I felt a profound satisfaction. My family was learning to act responsibly, thoughtfully, and respectfully, and I was quietly ensuring that the lessons would endure long after today. The journey from being perceived as a burden to being recognized as a strategic guide was well underway, and retirement had only enhanced my influence. A few days later, I observed yet another subtle shift in their behavior. Michael and Karen began consulting each other before making suggestions, weighing their words carefully and speaking with a newfound respect that had been absent weeks before. They were no longer acting from assumption or entitlement, they were acting with awareness, guided by the lessons the trust and my oversight had instilled. I decided it was time to introduce a scenario that tested both analytical thinking and ethical judgment. I framed it as a potential philanthropic initiative funded by a portion of the trust, a local community project in Austin. While the opportunity appeared lucrative in terms of public recognition, it had several hidden conditions: strict compliance requirements, potential reputational risk if mismanaged, and a need for careful allocation of resources. I explained the situation and let them deliberate without immediate guidance. Michael initially leaned toward allocating a large portion of funds quickly, excited by the idea of immediate impact. Karen reminded him to consider sustainability, compliance, and long-term implications. Their dialogue was measured, collaborative, and reflective, evidence that the lessons of patience, foresight, and respect had begun to take root. When they finalized their approach, I offered constructive guidance rather than corrections. "Your plan demonstrates comprehension and strategic thinking," I said. "It balances impact with prudence, ensuring that actions respect both the intent of the trust and the broader consequences of your decisions. Responsibility isn't simply about money, it's about exercising judgment within a framework designed to teach awareness, ethics, and foresight." Karen smiled thoughtfully. "I understand now that this isn't just a financial tool. The trust has taught us how to think, not just act." Michael nodded, his expression contemplative. "And patience is key. I never realized how much strategy is involved in even small decisions. We've learned more than we expected, and it's changing how we view responsibility entirely." Later, as they left, I reflected on the transformation. The subtle authority I had exercised over the past weeks had reshaped their perception, not just of the trust, but of me as a retiree. Retirement had not weakened my influence, it had sharpened it. Through careful guidance, structured challenges, and observation, I had created an environment where lessons could be learned naturally, internalized, and applied. The Texas sky was deep and clear, stars beginning to shimmer above the garden. The gentle night breeze rustled leaves, and I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. My family was learning to act with discretion, foresight, and respect. The trust was not merely a financial instrument, it was a teaching tool, a reflection of experience, and a subtle guide to navigating both responsibility and life. The next day, I observed Michael and Karen approaching their tasks with an increased level of diligence. They double-checked financial documents, communicated with each other more thoughtfully, and demonstrated subtle self-restraint, resisting the urge to rush decisions. The behavioral shift was remarkable, not forced, but internalized, a testament to the power of patient guidance and structured influence. I decided to introduce a scenario involving multiple competing priorities, a subtle test of strategy, judgment, and collaboration. I presented a situation where one of the trust's rental properties needed urgent repairs while another offered a rare investment opportunity with tight deadlines. They had to evaluate the risks, allocate resources, and make recommendations within the framework I had established. Michael immediately focused on seizing the investment opportunity, his instincts urging swift action. Karen interjected, urging caution and careful evaluation of the repair requirements, tenant satisfaction, and potential downstream consequences. They began to negotiate and adjust their approach, weighing short-term gains against long-term impact. As I observed, I noted their tone, body language, and phrasing. They were no longer defensive or reactive. Instead, they demonstrated awareness and respect for both the process and my oversight. I allowed them to present their final plan before commenting. "You've both done very well," I said. "This decision reflects understanding, patience, and foresight. You considered the immediate consequences, the long-term sustainability, and the responsibilities inherent in stewardship. Responsibility is not just about action, it's about judgment, balance, and respect for established principles." Karen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I see now that we used to make decisions impulsively, assuming authority without fully understanding consequences. The trust is teaching us far more than we expected." Michael added quietly, "And it's changing how we view you too. Retirement hasn't reduced your influence, it's clarified it. You're guiding us subtly, and we're finally paying attention." Later, after they left, I walked through the garden, reflecting on the subtle transformations. The lessons I had imparted weren't just about money, they were about discipline, foresight, and respect. The trust had become a tool for teaching these principles, and my family's responses had shown that they were absorbing them, slowly but effectively. The Texas sunset cast long, warm shadows over the property, a vivid reminder that clarity and patience endure beyond immediate perception. Retirement had given me time, perspective, and the ability to guide with subtle authority, transforming how my family approached responsibility and understanding the broader implications of their actions. As the night settled in, stars shimmering above, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Each interaction, each scenario, and each controlled lesson had reinforced the core principle: authority exercised with patience, foresight, and subtle guidance teaches lessons far more effectively than force or confrontation ever could. By the middle of the following week, I began noticing more proactive behaviors in both Michael and Karen. Michael would pause before offering suggestions, considering implications and long-term effects, while Karen started documenting observations, taking notes, and even highlighting areas that required caution. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. They were thinking strategically, guided by the lessons embedded in the trust and reinforced through my quiet oversight. I decided it was time to introduce a scenario involving external stakeholders, a way to test their ability to negotiate and apply judgment beyond our family circle. I presented a potential tenant dispute that required negotiation and compromise. The tenant sought concessions due to unexpected repair delays, and Michael and Karen were tasked with resolving it while maintaining the trust's integrity and financial stability. Michael initially focused on appeasing the tenant quickly, eager to resolve the conflict with minimal friction. Karen, however, urged caution, emphasizing adherence to contractual obligations, clear communication, and balancing the tenant's needs with long-term financial prudence. Their discussion was measured, respectful, and collaborative, a far cry from the impulsive, entitlement-driven interactions I had witnessed before. When they reached a solution, I reviewed their approach. "This is excellent," I said. "You've balanced immediate satisfaction with long-term responsibility. You considered the legal framework, financial impact, and human element. This demonstrates that true authority isn't just about making decisions. It's about thinking critically, anticipating consequences, and exercising discretion." Karen looked thoughtful. "I never realized how much patience and reflection are involved in decision-making. It's about more than rules, it's about judgment." Michael nodded. "And it's clear that retirement hasn't lessened your authority. Your guidance has shaped how we approach responsibility." "We're finally understanding that." Later that evening, I reflected on the week's progress. The trust had proven to be more than a financial instrument. It had become a teaching tool for responsibility, foresight, and respect. Each scenario, each subtle challenge, and each guided observation had reinforced the principles I hoped to instill. My family was no longer operating under assumption or entitlement. They were demonstrating awareness, patience, and strategic thinking. The Texas sky darkened, stars beginning to scatter across the horizon, and the warm wind carried the scent of blooming flowers. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Retirement had provided the perfect opportunity to exercise subtle authority, teaching lessons that could not be rushed or forced. My family's transformation was proof that patience, structure, and foresight are far more powerful than direct confrontation. As I stood on the porch, surveying the property, the trust, and the legacy it represented, I realized that my influence was not diminished by age. It had been sharpened by wisdom, guided by experience, and reinforced through careful planning. The journey from being treated like a burden to becoming a strategic mentor was well underway, and the lessons were taking root in ways that would endure for generations. A few days later, I introduced a scenario designed to test their ability to handle complexity while maintaining ethical judgment. I framed it as a potential partnership with a local business interested in leasing part of one of our properties. On the surface, it appeared lucrative, but hidden within the agreement were subtle clauses that could create legal or financial complications if not carefully analyzed. Michael immediately focused on the revenue potential, excited by the opportunity. Karen, recalling previous lessons, emphasized the need for careful review of every clause, potential risks, and long-term consequences. I observed quietly, allowing them to navigate the discussion without interference. Their approach was deliberate, analytical, and collaborative, a clear sign of growth and understanding. When they finalized their plan, I provided guidance. "You've approached this correctly," I said. "You've balanced opportunity with responsibility, evaluating both immediate and long-term implications. True authority is not about taking the quickest path, it is about understanding, evaluating, and acting with foresight. The trust exists not merely to manage wealth, but to teach comprehension, responsibility, and patience." Karen exhaled, a mixture of relief and realization on her face. "I see now that every decision has layers we hadn't considered before. This isn't just about money, it's about judgment, foresight, and integrity." Michael nodded, adding, "And it's clear that retirement hasn't weakened your influence. In fact, it has clarified it. You've structured a system where lessons are learned through observation, analysis, and responsibility." Later that day, I noticed both Michael and Karen applying these principles in subtle ways, reviewing correspondence carefully, consulting each other before taking action, and considering long-term consequences rather than seeking immediate gratification. The transformation was no longer superficial, it was behavioral, internalized, and consistent. As the sun began to set over the Texas plains, I walked the property, reflecting on the journey. From being treated like a burden to being acknowledged as a strategic guide, the past weeks had demonstrated that patience, foresight, and subtle authority could shape comprehension and behavior far more effectively than direct enforcement. Retirement had provided the ideal environment to observe, guide, and influence, turning lessons into internalized principles. The trust had evolved from a financial tool into a living framework for teaching responsibility, ethical judgment, and strategic thinking. Each scenario I had introduced, each observation I had made, and each subtle lesson I had reinforced had contributed to the transformation of my family's behavior and mindset. Standing on the porch under the expansive Texas sky, I realized that the greatest legacy I could leave was not simply wealth, but the ability to instill comprehension, foresight, and respect, principles that would endure long after my guidance. The journey was ongoing, but the foundation had been firmly established. The next week, I observed a subtle but significant development. Michael began taking notes during our discussions, a practice that had never occurred before. Karen also started preparing questions in advance, analyzing potential outcomes and referencing the trust's provisions more consistently. These changes reflected not only increased awareness, but also a growing respect for the structured guidance I had provided over the weeks. I decided it was time to introduce a scenario that combined financial, ethical, and strategic thinking, a comprehensive test of their decision-making growth. I presented a situation where two properties under the trust required urgent attention simultaneously. One had structural issues that could escalate if ignored, while the other offered an unexpected short-term leasing opportunity. They had to decide which action to prioritize and how to allocate resources without compromising long-term stability. Michael immediately gravitated toward maximizing immediate revenue, suggesting the leasing opportunity take priority. Karen interjected, highlighting the potential consequences of neglecting the structural repairs, emphasizing safety, legality, and long-term value. Their debate was thoughtful, respectful, and measured, reflecting the lessons of patience, discretion, and foresight that had been gradually instilled. I let them navigate the discussion, observing their tone, body language, and reasoning. Their collaboration was no longer influenced by haste or assumption. They were actively internalizing principles of responsible stewardship. When they finally presented a plan that balanced both short-term opportunity and long-term prudence, I offered constructive guidance rather than correction. "Excellent," I said. "This decision reflects true comprehension. You've weighed immediate benefits against potential risks, collaborated respectfully, and applied lessons of patience, foresight, and responsibility. Authority isn't about control, it's about guiding decisions and shaping understanding. You're beginning to internalize what this trust truly represents." Karen nodded thoughtfully. "It's clear now that every action carries consequences and rushing can be costly. We're learning to think beyond immediate gain." Michael added, "And I understand that your retirement hasn't diminished your influence. Your guidance has sharpened our thinking, teaching us responsibility and respect." Later that evening, I walked through the garden, reflecting on the transformation that had taken place over the past weeks. The trust was no longer simply a legal or financial instrument. It had become a living tool for shaping character, judgment, and decision-making. The lessons had been internalized, evident in their thoughtful actions, careful discussions, and consistent respect for the processes I had established. The Texas sky was painted with deep purples and oranges as the sun set, a reminder that patience, structure, and foresight endure far longer than immediate impulses. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction knowing that my family was learning to approach responsibility, judgment, and decision-making with clarity and respect, a transformation that would outlast any immediate gains or confrontations. A few days later, I decided to test their ability to anticipate challenges before they arose. I presented a scenario involving an upcoming property auction in a nearby town. While the opportunity seemed lucrative, it carried hidden risks, potential zoning conflicts, competitive bidders, and timing constraints. Michael and Karen were tasked with creating a plan to approach the auction while minimizing risk and maximizing potential returns. Michael, as usual, immediately focused on the opportunity for quick gains, considering aggressive bids and fast turnaround. Karen, however, reminded him to evaluate the details carefully, verify property titles, consider maintenance costs, and assess market trends. They began discussing the scenario in detail, weighing pros and cons, and collaboratively crafting a strategy that balanced ambition with caution. I observed quietly, taking note of their approach. Gone were the days of impulsive suggestions or assumptions. Now, their discussion reflected measured judgment, mutual respect, and foresight. Michael asked precise questions instead of asserting decisions, and Karen provided insights grounded in analysis rather than emotion. When they presented their final strategy, I commended them. This is exactly how decisions should be approached. You've considered both immediate opportunities and long-term consequences, consulted each other thoughtfully, and applied lessons of patience and responsibility. Authority is not about making choices for others. It's about enabling comprehension, guiding actions, and fostering respect for principles. Karen nodded, a soft smile on her face. I see now that the trust isn't just about wealth. It's about understanding consequences, planning ahead, and making informed choices. Michael added, and I understand that your retirement hasn't lessened your influence. It's clarified it. You've created a structure where lessons are learned naturally, through observation and participation, rather than through force or confrontation. Later that evening, after they left, I walked through the garden, the warm Texas breeze carrying the faint scent of flowers. I reflected on the ongoing transformation. Michael and Karen were no longer operating from impatience or assumption. They were internalizing the principles of responsibility, foresight, and respect, applying them not just to financial decisions, but to interpersonal interactions and strategic thinking. The sky deepened into indigo, stars emerging across the vast horizon. Retirement had provided the ideal environment to guide subtly, influence carefully, and teach lessons that would endure. The trust was no longer just a financial instrument, it was a living tool for shaping behavior, judgment, and understanding. My family was learning, gradually but profoundly, to act thoughtfully, strategically, and responsibly. The following week, I introduced a scenario that combined financial planning, ethical judgment, and interpersonal strategy. I presented a situation where a local nonprofit sought a sizable donation from the trust. While the opportunity promised community goodwill and public recognition, the nonprofit's requirements were complex, involving detailed reporting, timelines, and potential public scrutiny. The scenario tested their ability to balance generosity with responsibility. Michael initially focused on the visibility and immediate satisfaction of contributing a large sum, eager to showcase results. Karen, recalling lessons from prior exercises, emphasized the need to evaluate compliance, long-term implications, and alignment with the trust's values. Their discussion was methodical and thoughtful. Each spoke with care, considered the other's perspective, and collaborated on a plan that balanced generosity with oversight. I observed silently, noting their growth. Gone were the days of impulsive decision-making and assumption-driven actions. Now, they asked questions, analyzed outcomes, and considered both immediate and long-term effects. Their behavior reflected internalization of the principles I had instilled over weeks: patience, discretion, foresight, and respect for authority. When they presented their final strategy, I nodded approvingly. This plan demonstrates comprehension, judgment, and strategic thinking. You've weighed immediate benefits against potential risks, considered all stakeholders, and aligned actions with the trust's principles. Authority isn't about control, it's about guiding decisions and fostering responsibility. Karen reflected quietly. I understand now that the trust isn't just a tool for managing assets. It's a framework that teaches us how to think, plan, and act responsibly. Michael added, and I finally see that retirement hasn't reduced your influence, it's strengthened it. You've guided us to approach decisions with strategy, foresight, and respect rather than impatience or assumption. Later, as they departed, I walked through the garden under the warm Texas twilight. The trust had become more than a financial instrument. It was a living framework for teaching judgment, ethical thinking, and strategic decision-making. Each scenario I had designed, each lesson I had reinforced, had subtly reshaped their understanding and behavior. The night sky deepened, stars glimmering across the horizon, and the warm breeze carried the scent of jasmine and earth. I reflected on the journey from being treated like a burden to becoming a subtle guide and mentor. My retirement had not weakened my influence, it had clarified it. Through patience, observation, and carefully structured scenarios, I had cultivated comprehension, foresight, and respect within my family. For the final section of this first video, I decided to present a culminating scenario, one that would integrate all the lessons Michael and Karen had learned over the past weeks: patience, foresight, discretion, ethical judgment, and strategic thinking. I framed it as a long-term investment opportunity, a mixed-use property development on the outskirts of Austin. On the surface, the deal seemed profitable, but hidden within the paperwork were potential zoning issues, construction delays, and tenant disputes that could arise if decisions were rushed. Michael and Karen approached it cautiously, reviewing documents thoroughly and highlighting potential risks. They debated, proposed alternative strategies, and balanced immediate gains with long-term sustainability. Their discussion demonstrated clarity, maturity, and collaboration, qualities that had been absent at the start of our journey. I let them work through the scenario without interference, observing their approach. Michael asked questions that reflected analytical thinking rather than impulse. Karen offered solutions grounded in ethics and responsibility. Together, they crafted a strategy that mitigated risk, ensured compliance, and maintained both financial and reputational integrity. When they presented the final plan, I smiled. "This," I said, "is the culmination of everything you've learned. You've applied foresight, strategic judgment, and ethical considerations to a complex situation. You've shown patience, respect for process, and an understanding that authority is not simply about making decisions. It's about applying wisdom thoughtfully and responsibly." Karen reflected softly. "I see now that every decision carries consequences beyond immediate results. The trust has taught us to consider the broader picture, anticipate outcomes, and act with responsibility." Michael added, "And I finally understand that your retirement hasn't diminished your influence, it's sharpened it. You've created a system where lessons are learned through experience, observation, and careful guidance. We're finally seeing the purpose behind it all." Later, as they left, I walked slowly through the Texas garden under the deepening night sky. The property, the trust, and the lessons embedded within both had served their purpose, guiding my family from impulsive, assumption-driven behavior to thoughtful, responsible decision-making. The transformation was real, subtle, and lasting. Retirement had provided the perfect environment for observation, guidance, and subtle authority. The trust had become more than a financial tool. It was a living framework for shaping judgment, responsibility, and foresight. My family was no longer treating me as a burden. They were beginning to recognize the wisdom, strategy, and care behind every decision I had made. As the stars glittered above the vast Texas horizon, I reflected on the journey. Every lesson, every scenario, and every subtle nudge had prepared them to act responsibly and wisely. The first video's story concluded here, but the principles, awareness, and respect I had cultivated would continue to guide them and me for years to come.